Why is the American presidency restricted to 2 terms? If you remember some of what you learned in civics or history, you might think, it's because of the 22nd Amendment passed in 1951 that establishes the details of this, that no person can serve more than 2 terms as a president, and that if someone there's an emergency situation, a vice president becomes president due to the death of president and the like, that if you serve more than 2 years, that counts as a term. If you serve less than 2 years, that doesn't count as a term. So technically someone could serve for like 9.5 years if a vice president became president and ran for two more terms. So you could point to the 22nd Amendment and say, that's why the presidency is 2 terms. But that was passed in 1951. And that's 163 years after the Constitution was ratified, or was passed back in 1788, when George Washington became the first president. And so for 163 years before the 22nd Amendment was passed, that was the pattern. We didn't have a constitutional amendment. That was just how things were done. How was that pattern set? Well, if we're going to answer that question, get at more of a deeper, more fulsome answer to why is the American presidency 2 terms, we got to look at George Washington and what he knew of history. He knew the risk of military leaders becoming heads of state. There's an unfortunate tendency for people who have led armies who become heads of state to continue to be heads of state and not to relinquish the vast authority they have then been entrusted with. And so George Washington looked back across history to the Roman Republic to find his inspiration, his guidance on how to proceed. The person he looked back to was a fellow by the name, he looked back to a guy named Lucius Cincinnatus. And yes, that's where you get Cincinnati today. Same guy, the city's named after him. But Lucius Cincinnatus lived from 519 to 430 BC. He was a military leader and a politician of the early Roman Republic. And he obtained the highest elected position in the Republic in the year 460. He was a consul. Every year in the Roman Republic, there were 2 consuls, and this position was so important. The name of the year, it was the year that Lucius was consul. Like that's the year of Lucius, or the year of Cincinnatus. Right? So you name the years after who were the consuls for that year. And the consuls they led the armies of Rome, and the only people who could overturn what a consul did was the other consul, because there's 2 of them, right? So he finished his term as consul, then he went back to his farm. And then 2 years later, in 458 BC, he was called upon due to a crisis. The 2 consuls of that year, Minucius Esquilinus Agurinius and Nautilus Rutilius, I love Roman names, right? The 2 consuls, Minucius and Nautius, were leading the defense of the young republic against an invading force of Aquae, which were another Italian ethnic group from further north in the Italy, as we think of it today, and they were whooping them. The Aquae were whooping the Romans, and so Cincinnatus was called to come back to Rome and to lead the army to go and rescue the 2 consuls that were stuck, that were in distress. And what they did is the Roman Senate voted that Cincinnatus would be dictator. You see, this is, as far as I understand, this is where the concept of a dictator comes from. Originally, a dictator was someone the Roman Senate, they took all the power of Rome and said, you are now in charge of everything for this period of time. A dictator was someone the Roman Republic turned to and entrusted to solve a crisis, a problem that threatened the Republic, and it was a time limited. Cincinnatus was a dictator for 6 months. He was told, you have all authority in Rome. You got 6 months to solve it. Go save the armies, save the consuls, beat back the Aquae, protect the Republic. And so that's what he did. He called every able-bodied man. They march out. He does what he does well. He's a competent general. He accepts the surrender of the invaders. He brokers a peace. He comes home. 15 days later, he is done. And he goes back to his farm. And so he was given authority and power for up to 6 months. And then after 15 days, he didn't need it anymore. He'd done what he needed to do, what he was called to do. He handed the power back over. He went back to his farm. Later in his life, in 438 BC, something similar happens. The Senate calls upon Cincinnatus and says, we have hit another crisis. And I won't go into the details of that, but it's a similar sort of like existential threat to the Republic. Please come and be, we will entrust you with all authority and power. You shall be our dictator, and we will give you a term of time into which to solve this problem. And Cincinnatus, he's slowing down a bit. He shows up. He takes 21 days to solve the problem, and then he goes back to his farm. Cincinnatus becomes a legendary figure in the Roman Republic, sort of an exemplar of Roman virtue, someone who understands and you can trust with power, and someone who will never abuse that power. He had been entrusted with the ultimate authority of the Republic twice, and twice he had handed it back. And so when George Washington and the other leaders who are putting together the Constitution, they've already had the Articles of Confederation, the original governmental structure of the United States, and it just hadn't worked, right? The 13 colonies, each one had a veto power over anything they could do as a whole, and there was just no ability for the America to function as a nation, right? And so they needed to have something with a stronger executive. But these leaders of the nation understood the threat they'd come from. Like if they entrusted too much power to an executive, what is their risk is that they will have traded a British executive, a King George, who was not using authority and power wisely, right? They would change it for an elected president who would just hold on to power, and they would end up under someone else's thumb. And so as they're going through and creating what the governmental structure that we still live under to this day, Washington explicitly looked to Cincinnatus as his inspiration. The job of president was created around George Washington as the person who could be entrusted with such vast power and authority, right? And so that's what happened. Why did George Washington serve 2 terms as president? It's because he was looking back to Cincinnatus, who was entrusted with ultimate authority and power twice, and twice he walked away and went back to his farm. And so when George Washington had been entrusted with power twice, at the end of his 2 terms, he went back to his farm, just like Cincinnatus. And the pattern was set. And that's how things were done. The first person in that position, this is how we do it, and that's how we do it. The pattern is set. Eventually, yes, it was codified into law, but it was 163 years before we felt the need to do that, because that's just the way we do it. Another pattern begins as we look back into Genesis today. We're spending this chunk of time going back into Genesis, looking at the stories of our family, the family of the church, the family that begins with Abram. And as we go back to Abram, we go back to last week was Genesis 12. Now we're going to go into what happens in Genesis 14. In Genesis 14, we read a lot of names. There are just a lot of names in the first verses of chapter 14. But what it's laying out is that there's a battle. There's a lot of small kingdoms in this area in the promised land in which Abram and Lot have settled. There's a lot of various small kingdoms, various kings over those kingdoms, and it goes through and reads off all the kings, and they're having a spat. And so 4 kings line up against 5 kings, and they have this battle, and the details are that, really, the details that matter are that it's a mess, and in the middle of the mess, Lot, Abram's nephew, is captured. He is captured with all of his livestock, his household is all taken as plunder, and Abram has to gather the people of his household. And this starts to tell us how big of a household Abram has. He is able to gather 318 men who are trained to use arms, which is a lot, right? And so he is able to gather 318 of his people, and he sallies forth, and he goes to where his nephew Lot has been captured, and he frees his nephew and the livestock and the household and all the goods, and he is able to save his nephew from what otherwise would have been a very ugly situation, right? And so as Abram is returning from this unexpected little adventure, probably pondering what it was going to mean now that he has sort of like played his hand, like he has taken a side amongst all these various, at least 9 different kings and kingdoms within riding distance. Like he has gotten involved in politics. He's trying to ponder how he's going to handle this, is my guess. And as they're riding back, they meet someone on the road. We are told that they meet King Melchizedek of Salem. Now this name, it's one of those names that really isn't much of a name, if you make sense, right? The Melch of Melchizedek, the Melch is the word for king. And Zadok is righteous. And so Melchizedek means king of righteousness, or king committed to righteousness, or king of righteousness, like the righteous king, right? Righteousness is in charge. Like you could interpret the name in a couple different ways, but it's the name Melchizedek is righteous king. It's the righteous king of Salem. Salam, which is a form of shalom, which means peace, which we're eventually down the road, which is where you get Jerusalem, the peace, the place of peace, the peace of God, right? And so Melchizedek of Salem is the righteous king of peace, the king of righteousness who makes peace. Like it's a flexible translation, but that really isn't a name. It's more of a description of who he is. Whoever this guy is righteous, committed to God, because we read he's a priest of God, he's a servant of the Most High God. And so he gathers Abram and the people traveling, this righteous king of peace, and he sets out for them bread and wine. And then he prays for them. He blesses them. He says to them, he blessed and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." So what's this feel like? When a righteous person gathers people together in peace and sets bread and wine in front of them and then breaks the bread and then serves them and blesses them and says that God has established you. Like, what is, this start to feel like worship a little bit? This start to feel like something that's a little bit more than a snack by the side of the road? And so having something, this pattern that begins, this worship that begins, what is Abram's response? How does Abram respond to the word of God brought by the righteous person of peace, right? We read, and Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. This is Abram's response to the good news of that day, of being able to free his nephew and all the family, of being able to save that family's goods and livestock, what they needed. Right? His response was to make a gift that is given. I mean, remember, they're on their way home. They haven't yet gotten home. And so they haven't gotten home and had time to put everything away. This is a first fruits, so to speak. This is before anything else, this is a gift that they give. And that's the pattern that is set. In Abram's family, the way we respond to the goodness of God is to gather around a table with bread and wine, to give thanks, and then to offer and say thank you. Thank you for the graciousness. Thank you for the bounty. Thank you for what we have, for what we have been blessed with. Just like with Cincinnatus and Washington, when Washington starts something, it continues for a long time before it is codified, before it becomes a law, before it becomes an amendment to the Constitution. It's just, that's the way it's done. With Abram, what he starts is also, it's eventually codified, it is developed. It turns into the first fruits and the wave offerings and the different offerings that are developed over the year. There will eventually be further details. But what matters most, as I read Scripture, is to understand where the pattern comes from so that then we can say, yes, we're part of the family. We're part of the pattern. This is what the family does. Now it is our turn to do what the family does. And so, yes, as Americans, we can learn from Cincinnatus that it is vitally important that those entrusted with power must be able to step away from power and, to figuratively speaking, go back to the farm. Trust fellow Americans that there will be another person, another leader to follow. At our best, that is how America works. That's how this family of Americans functions. And more importantly, I would argue, as the family of the church, the family that looks back to Abram as our forefather, we can see that our worship always draws out a response of generosity. That is how we practice our faith. That's an essential part of how we practice our faith, is that after table is generous sharing. Now, we can get into the weeds on this. We can get into the weeds. Like, you could, if you want to sit down and drink a cup of coffee and discuss whether FDR, the only person to have served more than 2 terms, who was elected to 4 terms as president, remember, right? Was FDR breaking the pattern? Was that the necessary and sufficient response to a world at war? Or was that the cowardly response when he should have trusted other people to be able to step forward? Like, we could sit down and argue about that. It's kind of the exception, right? I don't know, right? We could argue about it, but it gets into the weeds. Like, we can do the same thing with this. Like, you want to sit down, you want to discuss, like, is that 10%, is that a pre-tax or is that a post-tax number? How about if I'm running low on funds for the month and, like, should I, if I'm not sure I have enough for groceries, should I make sure to fully tithe and then end up going to the food bank, or maybe not have enough to eat? Or should I get what I need to eat and then cut into what I'm tithing? Like, there's always complications. There's always sort of extreme cases. In my opinion, getting into the weeds, like, those are the distraction moments, right? We handle them as they come up. But we don't live most of our lives in complex situations. We don't live most of our lives in the weeds. Most of our lives, we just live normal day-to-day life. And so what I would suggest is that we figure out, in light of Abram, what a generous, thankful way of life looks like for us. Does it involve giving exactly 10%? No more, no less, each time we gather for worship? I mean, it can. But we're not talking about rules and laws, we're talking about family. This is how we do things, right? The goal here is to become an even more consistently generous and gracious family. So let's remember how this begins, right? Let's remember how this would have felt. Abram has just saved his nephew. In a moment of risk, like, now there's this joy, and they're gathered around a table, and they're having a great time, and there is wine, and there is bread, and they are thankful, and they are celebrating, and out of that moment they give generously. That is how this is meant to feel. That's how that's how we as a family handle generosity. This is not a sitting down and precisely working out every last cent because we have to be. That kind of misses the point. how do we live generously? How do we respond to the goodness of God with the same joy that we see in Abram in this moment? It is out of that sense of joy and appreciation that we seek to live. And in doing so, what we're doing is we're weaving together our lives into becoming a church community that is generous and joyous and gracious with each other, that is capable of being good news with and for each other, and good news for the community that is around us. That is the path Abram sets us on as his descendants, as his family. Thanks be to God. Amen.